There we go. All right, hi. I'm Julia Mason, and I've been a pediatrician for over 30 years. I've had a special interest in ADHD for decades. I got pulled into the gender controversy in late 2018, and I became a founding member of SEGM, the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, in 2019. I have been a thorn in the side of the American Academy of Pediatrics, my professional organization, for almost 5 years. Trying to get them to take a measured look at the state of the evidence supposedly supporting pediatric sex trait modification. I specifically asked for a systematic review of the evidence. Over a year ago, they said they would finally do a systematic review of the evidence, but there's no sign of that happening. Has anyone seen the program for the WPATH meeting? Like, is there anything about the AAP doing? No, I don't think so. In fact, right now, in Florida, the AAP is having their annual national conference, and a special keynote speaker this year is none other than Assistant Secretary of Health, Admiral Rachel Levine. Boo, our favorite. Wait. Okay, I'm here to talk about brain development in adolescence and young adulthood. Adolescence is a significant period of brain maturation, second only to the time of early development between birth and 6 years of age. The brain is the last organ of the body to mature, and it matures under the influence of sex hormones. Many experts have described adolescence as occurring between age 10 and age 25. As a pediatrician, when I'm asked how long I'll see a patient, I usually say, until you're 18, 21 if I like you. But the truth is that brain development continues past both those ages. And when conditions like ADHD or autism are present, full maturation can be delayed even past age 25, more like 30. Human societies have restricted access to adult activities such as marriage, voting, buying alcohol, tattoos, renting a car, and adopting a child to various ages between 16 and 25. It's generally recognized that young people can't always be trusted to make good decisions, particularly on hot-button issues. Yeah. Okay, let's talk brain development. Most of you have heard the idea that the brain isn't fully mature until age 25. The images here were obtained by getting sequential MRI scans on the same individuals over a more than 10-year period. The pattern of maturation is very similar in most individuals, but the timing will vary. From early adolescence through their mid-20s, a young person's brain develops somewhat unevenly from back to front. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, important for controlling impulsive decisions, is among the last brain regions to mature, and it doesn't reach adult dimensions until the 20s. And then these are images from the same study, but I wanted to show you these because they go back to 5 years of age, and you can really see the colors shift. The colors represent myelination, or to be more precise, the red is pure unmyelinated gray matter, the part of the brain responsible for information processing. Going to blue or purple indicates myelination, and this is a way to visualize the synaptic pruning that is a big part of brain development in adolescence. From birth to 6, the brain is just building and building neurons and potential. A 3-year-old could learn any language, or even multiple. At the same time, a 3-year-old will believe almost anything you tell them, and we don't let them decide what's for dinner. In childhood, and especially in adolescence, there is a pruning process. It is quite literally use it or lose it. The neural connections that are retained get myelinated and thereafter can communicate much more quickly. Myelination is like the insulation that we put on electrical wires. It's one reason that an experienced driver can operate a car with very little conscious thought. The pathways for this relatively complicated process are well myelinated. So we start life with a lot of synaptic growth, but this is necessarily followed by significant synaptic pruning. A newborn is still developing their brain. A 7-year-old has a brain full of potential and the capacity to believe in magic. And the 15-year-old is starting to select which neuronal connections will be maintained and sped up via myelination. A 6-year-old has more neurons in their brain than any of us here, but it's complete chaos in there. It's like a tangle of copper wires. It's not hard to convince a 6-year-old that a fat man in a red suit comes down the chimney every year to deliver toys to the well-behaved. Because younger brains have more neurons, but slower connections, one of the biggest differences between the developing adolescent brain and a mature adult brain is how decisions are made. As I mentioned, brain maturation during adolescence involves synaptic pruning, myelinization, and maturation of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that responds to situations with good judgment. The limbic system pointed, I thought I'd have a pointer, but pointed in there in the middle, and the amygdala and the ventral striatum develops sooner than the prefrontal cortex, and thus is more dominant in youth. Teens process information with the amygdala. And this is the emotional core of the brain. Young people feel things more intensely and are sometimes immune to logic. They will make a different decision when their emotions are running hot than they would when they are calm, cool, and collected. This can lead to regret. Mature adults lean on the prefrontal cortex for making decisions, which gives them better awareness of things like the potential long-term consequences of a particular decision. The implications for pursuing a medical pathway with permanent bodily changes and potential loss of fertility are obvious. Going on. Beyond just normal development, I'd like to note how neurodiversity, specifically ADHD and autism, can further delay the development of mature decision-making skills. Just about everyone agrees that in ADHD, maturation of the prefrontal cortex is delayed, some say by about 30% compared to same-age peers. The development of the prefrontal cortex was delayed 5 years in one study. This implies that young people with ADHD may not be making their best decisions until they're around 30 years old. And because our lives aren't complicated enough, up to 20-25% of children with ADHD fall on the autism spectrum, ASD, and as many as 50 to 60% or more of children on the autism spectrum have ADHD. Both types of neurodiverse kids can be drawn into gender ideology, either via hyperfocus or it being a special interest. Gender promises to explain why a young person isn't fitting in with their peers, and it seems to have a plan to fix everything, if only you believe. And then autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder that changes the development of the brain in more ways than just the timing. On the left is an image from a study that demonstrated slower development of white matter, the myelination, in the brains of autistic boys. On the right is a figure from a review paper on how executive function is affected in autism. As usual, it's complicated and beyond the scope of this talk. Executive function is impaired in autism as well as in ADHD, but it is not necessarily happening in the same way. I learned this when I tried to treat a very hyperactive and impulsive autistic boy with stimulants to help him focus, and they didn't help one bit. I'm not the only one who is struck by the overrepresentation of autism in young people and adults in the trans community. It's easier for me to understand how a girl with undiagnosed autism can discover trans and feel like it explains everything that has gone wrong for her in her life up to that point. The autistic brain is described as an exceptionally male brain by some experts. That said, I recall Dr. Az-Hakim saying that adult male autists were more likely to be satisfied with their transition as long as everybody followed the rules and used the correct name and pronouns. And then here's another way to look at adolescent development. I love this slide. This is by Rita Kerta-Kaltiala. She's an adolescent psychiatrist in Finland who was tasked with setting up an adolescent gender clinic there in 2011. 9 years later, she showed that the difference between those who did well after medical transition versus those who did not was pretty simple. If they were doing well before, they continued. If they were struggling before transition, the treatment did not cure their ills. In February of this year, she published a key paper All-cause and suicide mortalities among adolescents and young adults who contacted specialized gender identity services in Finland, 1996 to 2019. That was published in British Medical Journal of Mental Health. This was a registry-based paper in a country with nationalized medicine, so no loss to follow-up. And it showed that gender-affirmative care did not reduce the risk of suicide in young people, but also, the risk was quite low. It was not zero, but it was equivalent to that for young people with other mental health issues. She developed this image for a paper on adolescent forensic psychiatry to illustrate that the actions of adolescents can fluctuate wildly in terms of maturity. So you can see that physical development advances most rapidly and peaks soon after age 16. Cognitive development lags a bit. It starts out increasing more rapidly and then it slows down. Emotional development actually backtracks roughly in middle school and then proceeds to improve, with the boys lagging behind the girls a bit. Finally, ranging wildly between the higher cognitive abilities and the lesser emotional capabilities is the behavior of the individual young person. One day, they are taking good care and making good decisions, and the next day, they're letting things go and making poor decisions. Okay, I was taught that there are 10 tasks of adolescence, things that need to be accomplished in order to be a successful adult. Adjust to a sexually maturing body. The brain does not get much bigger during adolescence, but the body sure does. Puberty is a very uncomfortable time for everyone. One of the problems with gender ideology, as it is currently presented to kids, is the idea that if you are uncomfortable with your body, maybe that's because you were born in the wrong body. It's an idea that falls apart if you look at it critically, but at the same time, it is enormously appealing. And then develop and apply abstract thinking skills. As a child moves through adolescence into adulthood, they're moving from what Piaget called concrete operational thought to formal operational thought. You start to be able to think less concretely and more abstractly. Teens can ponder possibilities, try out hypotheses, and they can get all meta and think about thinking. Learn to take on multiple perspectives. Yeah. Being able to imagine how another person sees things differently, well, that's a skill that most of us still need to practice. If you can put yourself in another person's shoes, you have a better ability to resolve problems and conflicts. And then develop and apply new coping skills in problem solving and decisions. With their developing intellects, teens and young adults ideally are better able to think about and plan for the future and to moderate their risk-taking to serve goals rather than jeopardize them. This is a long developmental process, and I've already discussed that, particularly with respect to risk assessment and decision-making. Identify meaningful moral standards, values, and belief systems. I'm certainly not the first to notice that gender ideology appears to be functioning as a sort of religion for many people, with the mysterious gender identity being internal, eternal, and immutable, like a soul. I think that many people in wealthy countries are suffering from a lack of meaning and purpose. I wish that I could turn everyone's minds towards what I judge to be useful pursuits, like planting trees, doing earthworks for water retention landscapes, and making food without chemicals. But alas, here I am talking about gender. Understand and express more complex emotional experiences. As a person matures, they learn that emotions can be complicated. There are good and bad aspects of most things, and often the best solution is a compromise. This one can take a while. And then meet the demands of increasingly mature roles and responsibilities. This is so important and also so not happening, particularly with my trans-identified patients. One of my early concerns about gender-affirming care was that most of my trans-identified patients were not going to college, learning a trade, or doing other appropriate young adult things. They were stalled out, developmentally speaking, working unskilled jobs for minimum wage with no clear plans for the future other than to medically transition. It's like the difficult path of transition was substituting for more useful struggles, what I like to call doing hard things now to make your life easier later. Form friendships that are mutually close and supportive. Adolescence is a time of powerful peer influence. Young people shift from friendships based largely on shared interests and activities to those based on the sharing of ideas and feelings. The internet has complicated this task because it's easy to find online groups that share the most obscure interest, and this can distract young people from the important task of finding their tribe in real life. Establish key aspects of identity. Well, this is what it's all about for our gender-confused young people. I'm going to touch back on this one. Renegotiate relationships with adults in parenting roles. I often tell parents of smaller children that when they're 2, it's a dictatorship, and when they're 18, it's a democracy. And the art of parenting is managing that long transition. Parenting a teenager is hard, and parenting a young adult can be even harder, because as a parent, you are no longer in control of what happens. Something I tell parents of trans-identified young adults is that you have to be quiet enough in your very legitimate concerns so that your child can hear their own niggling doubts about what is the best course of action. If you are trying to stop them with all your might, then they will apply their usually formidable intellect towards the problem of getting past you, instead of taking ownership of their own decisions. Think back to the developmental differences in decision-making. A young person will make a different decision in the heat of an argument than they will make in a cooler situation. Some of us have a pretty strong oppositional reflex, even as adults. To repeat, you have to be quiet in order for your child to be able to hear their own doubts. And then, over 5 years ago, I overheard one of my kids' friends earnestly talking about how hard it is to decide on what your gender is. I realized with horror that many youth of today truly believe that one of their most important tasks as an adolescent is to gaze inward and deduce their one true gender. It's a natural thing for adolescents to wonder who they are, but it seems that the only acceptable version of this, at least in certain modern, mostly urban, mostly liberal enclaves, is to deduce before any real experience your gender and your sexuality. There is literally a website called the Gender Wiki, and it contains a crowdsourced list of possible genders. All I could fit in my screenshot was A and some of B. It's a lot. It's very normal for teenagers to seek a unique identity, to want to have quirks. What is not normal is for the entire ecosystem of adults and authorities working with young people to encourage them down a path that leads to medicalized self-harm. And to finish, Oscar Wilde had a good answer to the identity question. Question.